Ray and Shirley Conan's three-day whirlwind through London in May 1967 captures a city at a unique crossroads where the grand traditions of the British Empire were beginning to collide with the high-voltage energy of the swinging 60s. Their travel notes aren't just a list of sights, they're a granular record of what it actually felt like to navigate the London fog of a spring drizzle while the city's streets were physically shifting under the weight of cultural revolution.
It's a fascinating snapshot because 1967 was the height of that cultural shift. You have the Conans sitting down for a traditional roast beef dinner at Simpson's in the Strand, which had been a bastion of British upper-class dining since 1828, while just outside the windows, the streets were filled with a massive communist demonstration and the psychedelic vibes of the Summer of Love. They were seeing a city that was simultaneously very old and startlingly new.
They started their Sunday on May 7th with a classic continental breakfast and a bold decision to head out on foot. But the first hurdle wasn't the distance, it was the geography. They described London as a complete maze of winding, bending streets that changed names every other block. Is that just tourist frustration, or was the city layout actually that chaotic back then?
London's layout is essentially medieval bones, with Victorian and post-war skin stretched over it. Unlike a grid city like New York or Chicago, London evolved organically. You can be on a main thoroughfare, and it will suddenly pivot 30 degrees and become a completely different named street. For travelers in '67, before digital maps, you were reliant on the AZ paper guides, which were legendary for their complexity. Finding London Bridge, as they tried to do, was genuinely a challenge because the streets in the City of London are some of the oldest and most irregular in the world.
And the weather certainly didn't help. They mentioned it was sprinkling in sun or shade, and then suddenly raining in buckets while they were right in the middle of London Bridge. They got soaked and had to find refuge under a canopy with a group of cyclists they described as looking like they were out of a book. That rain seems like the quintessential London experience, but it actually forced them to change their entire strategy.
That rain-slicked pavement is the literal backdrop of the 1960s London aesthetic, but notice how they pivoted. They hopped on the number 11 bus. Now, the number 11 is arguably the most famous bus route for a sightseer. In 1967, it ran all the way from Shepherd's Bush in the west to Liverpool Street in the east. It passed almost every major landmark: the King's Road in Chelsea, Victoria Station, Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's. Riding on the top deck of an AEC Routemaster, which had only been the standard for a few years then, gave them that riding a horse feeling Shirley mentioned.
That's such a vivid description. She said her hip sockets felt like she'd been riding a horse for a week straight because of the motion on that upper deck. It really highlights the physical toll of 1960s travel. They spent an hour and a half going to the end of the line and another hour and a half back. For 3 hours, they just soaked in the solidly packed rows of three-story houses and alleys that had their own alleys. It sounds like they were trying to grasp the sheer density of the place.
They were witnessing the remains of the Victorian terrace housing boom. Many of those areas were still showing the scars of the Blitz from 20 years earlier, but the sheer scale of the brick-and-mortar rows is what hits a visitor from the States. It's a different kind of urban density. And then, amidst all this traditional sightseeing, they run into that huge communist parade on May 7th. That wasn't just a random event, it was likely the traditional May Day march.
Right, although May 1st is the official day, the major marches often happened on the following weekend. Shirley described them as being against everything. In May 1967, what would a demonstration like that have been focused on? Was it just labor rights, or was there more tension in the air?
It was a volatile mix. You had the traditional trade unions marching for better pay, but by 1967, these demonstrations were becoming focal points for anti-Vietnam War protests and broader anti-establishment sentiment. The weirdos Shirley mentioned seeing were likely the early hippies or flower children who were starting to congregate in places like Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus. The clash between the stern, banner-carrying Marxists and the flamboyant youth culture must have been quite a sight for a couple from the U.S.
After a long day of buses and parades, they ended up at a place called the Golden Egg for dinner. Shirley called it a bacon and eggs place. It sounds almost like a diner, but was there something specifically British about it?
The Golden Egg was a massive phenomenon in the 60s. It was one of the first successful table service fast food chains in Britain. Before the Golden Egg, your options were often very formal restaurants or very basic, greasy spoons. The Golden Egg brought in bright, jazzy colors and a menu that focused heavily on, well, eggs and chips. For the Conans, it was probably a relief to find something that felt somewhat familiar, though Shirley made sure to note that British pork sausage is different. British sausages, or bangers, have a much higher cereal or breadcrumb content than American ones, which gives them that distinct, softer texture that takes some getting used to.
Monday, May 8th, was their all-day tour day. This was the deep dive into the historical heavyweights: Westminster, the Tate Gallery, the Tower of London, and St. Paul's Cathedral. They even tried to see the changing of the guard, but the rain intervened again. It's interesting that despite the weather, they didn't slow down. They went to the tower and saw the crown jewels and the bloody tower. It's a very traditional itinerary, but they capped it off with a dinner that was anything but basic.
They went to Simpson's in the Strand for roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. This is the gold standard of British dining. Even in 1967, Simpson's was famous for its master carvers who would wheel a silver-domed trolley to your table and carve the beef to your exact preference. It was a place where Winston Churchill had a regular table. For the Conans to go there shows they were really leaning into the high culture side of the trip as well. It's the ultimate I'm in London meal.
And then they went from that formal elegance straight to the Sherlock Holmes tavern for a couple of pints. She said the place was jumping. That's a great example of the social range they were exploring. One minute you're being served by a master carver in a wood-paneled dining room, and the next you're in a crowded pub that was actually a themed establishment created just a decade earlier for the Festival of Britain.
Exactly. The Sherlock Holmes pub on Northumberland Street actually houses a replica of Holmes's study at 221B Baker Street, which was originally an exhibit. It was one of the first themed pubs. In 1967, it would have been a prime spot for tourists and locals alike. It highlights that London was starting to lean into its own literary and historical brand to attract that post-war travel boom.
By the third day, May 9th, they seemed to have mastered the tube, taking it to Harrods. They spent the morning shopping and had the classic tea and scones lunch. But the real highlight of that day was their encounter at Buckingham Palace. Shirley wrote that they saw the Queen and King and guards in full regalia. Now, in 1967, there wasn't a King of England. Was she seeing a visiting royal?
That's exactly what was happening. Historical records show that King Frederick IX and Queen Ingrid of Denmark were in London for an official visit in early May 1967. They were often guests of Queen Elizabeth II, as the royal families are closely related. So the Conans didn't just see the British Queen, they caught a glimpse of a state-level event. Seeing the guards in full regalia usually means the ceremonial bearskin hats and red tunics, which only come out for specific occasions, or the formal guard change. It was incredibly lucky timing.
The luck didn't extend to their navigation, though. They took a bus to Kensington but rode too far and ended up walking for miles. They eventually found Kensington Garden and the palace where Princess Margaret lived. This is such a great detail because Margaret and her husband, Lord Snowdon, were the ultimate symbols of that swinging London crossover. They were royals who hung out with rock stars and photographers.
They lived in apartment 1A at Kensington Palace, which they had famously renovated into this very chic, modern yet classic space. While the Conans were walking past the gates, Margaret might have been inside hosting someone like Peter Sellers or a member of the Beatles. It's that collision again, the ancient walls of a palace housing the most avant-garde couple in the country.
After miles of walking, they ended up at another pub for Scotch eggs and tea. Shirley's food notes are so consistent. She's trying everything: roast beef, different sausages, tea at every stop, and finally, the Scotch egg. It seems like the food was as much of an adventure as the landmarks.
The Scotch egg is the quintessential British snack food, but in the 60s, it was actually going through a bit of a rough patch. Mass production was starting to lower the quality in some places, but in a good pub, it was still a solid, reliable meal. For Shirley to mention it alongside tea and fruit suggests they were really embracing the local high tea and pub grub culture as a way to fuel those long walks.
The sheer physical effort of this trip is what stays with me. They walked miles, rode buses to the end of the line just to see the streets, climbed to the upper decks, and navigated a city that was a maze. They weren't just checking boxes, they were immersing themselves in the rhythm of the place, even when it meant getting soaked completely on London Bridge.
It's a reminder that travel in 1967 required a level of grit. You didn't have a phone to tell you when the next bus was coming or exactly where you were. You had to ask people, you had to get lost, and you had to deal with the rain. But because of that, their memories were tied to the sensory details, the jumping pub, the French tour guide, the specific taste of a different sausage. They weren't just seeing London, they were experiencing the friction of a city in transition.
Their journey through that transitional London of 1967 reminds us that the best travel stories usually happen in the gaps between the famous landmarks, in the rain-soaked retreats under canopies, and the long bus rides through nameless streets. It's in those moments that a city truly reveals itself. Share this episode with someone who loves a good travel story or a bit of mid-century nostalgia.